Aha. Okay. We are in the middle. We stopped. We skipped a week at a very inopportune time. Actually, it's very bad, which means we're going to have to spend a lot of time today reviewing, which is not really bad. It's not as exciting as doing new things, but it's not very bad. It's actually very good. We are on chapter 3 of Mitzvahs Hamanas Elokus. We're actually beginning to start to. We've said so far. The general recap is we've said so far what faith and knowledge are according to Jewish philosophy. We've said so far what faith and knowledge are according to Kabbalah, very briefly. We've yet to really get into what Chassidus has to say about this. And this chapter is really the springboard into Chassidus' understanding of the interplay of faith and knowledge, and what faith is and what knowledge is, and what it really means to have faith in Hashem. Now, we are in the middle of a discussion. We started this chapter by speaking about the Rambam's 13 principles of faith. One of those principles of faith is that Hashem is Echad HaEmes. Hashem is the true oneness with absolute simplicity. And God has no parts. He has no body. He is absolute simplicity. Right? This is the conclusion that you must come to if God is to be God. In other words, if God is the necessary being, if God is the being who He provides existence to everything else, but nothing provides existence to Him, He's not dependent, or the more precise word is He's not contingent. He's not a contingent being. He exists because He must exist. He doesn't exist depending on any other cause or any other principle or any other reality. If all of that is true, then God must not have parts, right? We went through the basic logic last time that if God has parts, then the parts are parts of a whole, and it becomes a question. So they're caused by the whole. They only are defined in terms of the whole. They're not simple. Simple. If God is to be God, He must be simple. Now, we explained that the Rambam, the problem with saying God is simple is that it contradicts all of the Torahim, all of the descriptions of God that are in the Torah. For example, we say that God is wise or God is knowing, right? We immediately have a problem, right? If he has wisdom, then wisdom is secondary to His essence. His wisdom is not what He is, right? Which is a problem, because now you have a God who basically has parts. There's Him and there's His wisdoms. There's Him, His wisdom, and then there's the world that he apprehends. Right? If you want to say it, which is we're going to get more into tonight. If you want to say it differently, you could say that. Well, let's. So that's the question. The question is how can God have knowledge? How can God be wise? Or for that matter, anything else that the Torah says He is. How could He be kind? How could He be loving? How could He be? The Torah says God is a jealous God, right? He says there's lots of terms that are ascribed to God. How can any of these descriptions hold by God if God has no parts, right? With a person, the person and the knowledge are clearly separate. The person and their capacity to know are clearly two separate things. So how can you say that God knows something? That means God has parts. There's God and there's His capacity to know. And this is contradictory to one of the principles of faith. The Rambam's answer to this dilemma is the famous statement that God doesn't know the same way that we know. God knows things by being the knower, the knowledge, and the known at the same time. God knows things, in other words, by knowing Himself. Now, what is this answer and what isn't this answer? I feel maybe we could clarify more of what we did last week, because we had some. It's too bad Eyal's not here, because he was the one who was asking a lot of questions about this last time. What the Rambam still says that there is no positive definition that you can ascribe to God. There's no positive way of describing Him. Every way that you describe God is negative theology, right? You only say what God isn't, not what He is, right? When you say that God is wise, what you're really saying is that He doesn't lack anything. He's not unwise in any way. He is totally not unwise. God has no lacks. God is not missing anything. But you don't actually say that God is wise, because God can't be defined by any terms or any categories that we have. He transcends and is beyond all of those categories. Now, when the Rambam says, when Maimonides says that He is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once, what he's really saying is that this is the highest way of thinking about what God is without defining him. This is not a definition. When he's saying God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, for the same price, he could be saying God is the lover, love, and the beloved, right? For the same price. In other words, we're not saying that God is a specific thing, and that thing is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. On the contrary, he's saying that the knower, the knowledge, and the known, to be the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. In other words, that God knows the world by knowing himself, and that act together of God knowing the world by knowing himself, and the knowledge that generates is all one thing, and that one thing is God, is really not something that we can wrap our minds around. This is something that is beyond understanding, categorization, and definition. But what the Rambam is explaining ultimately is that where we find the highest form of everything that's within the world, and the highest thing that's within the world is knowledge, and the highest form of knowledge is God simply being God. And God being God knows himself in perfection, he is lacking nothing, and through his knowledge of himself, he knows everything. That is how God's omniscience works. So it's not an answer in terms of you can actually say, this is how God knows things, right? We're reaching a point in descriptions. When you get to speaking about God himself, right, all descriptions are obviously going to have trouble. If there was an easy way to describe him, right, then he wouldn't be God. So when we say that he's the knower, the knowledge, and the known, we're not saying an affirmative, positive categorization about him. We're not saying this is what God is. We're saying that God lacks it is a limitation of a human being that their knowledge is separate from them. God does not have that limitation. There's nothing that's hidden from God, but when everything that he knows, so to speak, he knows not in the way that we know it. He's not limited by that limitation, that our knowledge is separate from us. On the contrary, God is the knower, he is the knowledge, and he is what is known, and that's the nature of his unity. Now, we finished class last week by saying that we read the famous, we should probably read it again actually. We are on page 67 in the English. I thought you have one. Don't you have your own? Don't you have one that's yours?
This one's marked EP. ZW. Thank you.
Okay. So we have so on this understanding of God, of the Rambams, that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, we have a famous note in Tanya, a famous footnote in Tanya. We're on page 67 of the English translation. And the Alter Rebbe says as follows. The Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, writes in Tanya like this. And this is the what's called the Mu'at HaMachzekes HaMeruba. It's a footnote of few words that really contains worlds, because what the Alter Rebbe is really doing, which is quite astonishing, is that he is melding Kabbalah and philosophy. He is saying that the philosophical understanding of God, of the Rambam, that what we've been describing, that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and that's the nature of his simplicity. When we say God is one, that's what we mean. We mean that he's the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. In other words, that his knowledge or his faculties is not a contradiction to his oneness. This whole understanding of God is a subset, or fits more or less neatly within Kabbalah, which is an unbelievable bridging of worlds, right? Because Kabbalah is an affirmative process of describing, part of what Kabbalah is at least, is an affirmative process of describing the whole of Seder Shtalshalos. We describe many, many different levels or realms or dimensions of spirituality that God expresses himself in the process of creating our world, which is called Seder Shtalshalos, the chain-like order of the worlds, or it's very hard to translate. But basically, all the description of all the different interlocking and interrelated levels of godliness, and that's much of what the Kabbalah describes, is these different levels, and the lights, and the vessels, and the angels, and all the spiritual beings that exist at all the different levels, and all of these things, the tzimtzumim and the contractions, and all the different things that exist in the Kabbalah, which, so to speak, go on the map of the spiritual reality through which God creates the world. all of that seems to have very little to do with that's all received wisdom, right? Kabbalah means received wisdom. So in other words, basically, Kabbalah's authority that Kabbalah is founded on is basically prophecy. There is no logical process whereby a person starts by looking at the world and concludes that there are 4 spiritual realms: Atzilus, Yetzirah, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, Nasiya. There's no linking there. There's no way of looking at the world and coming to that conclusion. Once you know, perhaps it makes sense. But the point is that Kabbalah, the whole chiddush, the whole innovation of Kabbalah is that God himself revealed how he creates the world, that there's a divine wisdom, there's a divine philosophy. God revealed his own wisdom and his own philosophy in the nature of the world and the nature of reality through Kabbalah. Philosophy, on the other hand, of the sort that the Rambam did when he came to the conclusion that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, is on the contrary a process of looking at the world and realizing that the world on its own terms must have a creator, and you extrapolate up and abstract up from the world and come to the conclusion, some conclusions about what the creator is, or at least in the Rambam's case, strictly what the creator is not. Right? You come to a bunch of conclusions about what the creator is not. The creator who must exist, you come to the conclusions about what the creator is not. So they're basically 2 completely different worlds. There's no reason per se why these 2 things would need to be bridged, right? In other words, you could say there are 2 different ways of looking at the same reality. You could say it's like bridging biology and musical composition, right? You could, if you really wanted to, and it takes a lot of hard work, and to find a unified theory may be very, very, very difficult, and we may not be there yet in our knowledge in either field, but it would be an amazing accomplishment if you could bridge these 2 worlds, which essentially go in opposite directions. Kabbalah is a top-down, God explaining the creation to man. Philosophy is man himself working up from the world and coming to his own conclusions about God. Right? They work essentially, one is top down and one is bottom up. Right? So the Alter Rebbe, in one short little footnote, right at the beginning of Tanya, basically bridges these 2 things. And he says that the Rambam's understanding of God fits into a certain spiritual level within Kabbalah. In other words, the Rambam's negative perception of God is true in the eyes of Kabbalah, up to a certain point in the spiritual worlds. In other words, if you are the Kabbalah is basically acknowledging that if a person looks at the world and uses and thinks rigorously and works his way back up and abstracts away the world up to a conception of the Creator, he will come to a true conclusion. He will come to a true understanding of what the Creator is not, right, or what the Creator is, to use simpler language. But that understanding within the Kabbalah is limited. That understanding has limits. You can only, the highest that you will ever be able to understand, working with the world and logic back towards God, has a limit. And the limit is not God. You won't reach God himself as he's conceived of within the Kabbalah that way. You will reach an understanding of God as he expresses himself to do a certain thing. Because ultimately that's what as we've explained before, that's what all of Kabbalah is describing. Kabbalah's different levels and all the spiritual realms and spiritual dimensions are all basically different ways of God expressing himself. They're all different expressions of Elokus, godliness, right? Which is not God but is not the world. It is something which reflects God. Something which God which is not God but yet reflects him. All the spiritual worlds, at least above Atzilus, all of the higher spiritual realms and things like that are of this nature, that they express godliness. They're not really creations. They're expressions of God. And the Kabbalah, the Alter Rebbe is basically acknowledging that there's an expression of God which perfectly fits the Rambam's description of what God is. But it's only an expression of him. It's not God himself. So in other words, the Alter Rebbe would tell you that when you read the Rambam and the Rambam talks about God, to the Rambam that is God. Because it is God expressing himself at the highest point at which human intellect is able to grasp. But when you switch over to the Kabbalah, what the Rambam is describing is not God himself. What the Rambam thought to be God himself is really a certain expression of God. It's a very high expression of God. In fact, it's an expression of God which we say is completely unified with him. And nevertheless, it's only an expression. It's not God himself. So let's read the footnote. The footnote is on page 67. Of the last two lines in the column, the last two lines on 67. The sages of the Kabbalah agree to the Rambam's statements. It's written in the Pardes from the Ramak of Moshe Cordovero, one of the great Kabbalists, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is going to come up again in our study of this discourse. But V'gam lefi Kabbalas HaArizal, and also according to the Kabbalah of the Arizal, as people quickly learn when they begin to study the Kabbalah is not monolithic. The Kabbalah has many streams, many different paths. There have been many, many, many Kabbalists. But two of the greatest were the Ramak and the Arizal. And the Ramak and the Arizal both agree on this point. With regards to the investiture of God's infinite light into the creation, through many contractions into the vessels of Chabad of Atzilus, of Chochmah Bina Das, of the first three spheres of Atzilus, which are the intellectual spheres. In other words, with regards to the way God expresses himself, right, and the tzimtzumim, the contractions, are what make it an expression and not him himself. That's what a tzimtzum is. A tzimtzum allows for the possibility of something to exist outside of the Creator. We're not going to talk about tzimtzum now because that can go on forever. The point is that as God expresses himself in the highest spheres of the world of Atzilus, in other words, what we would call the intellectual faculties of Atzilus, the highest of the four spiritual worlds, God, as he expresses himself there, is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. That is God's expression, what the Rambam thought when he had found God and abstracted everything away, and this was his negative definition of God, this was the highest that he could go. This is what exists in the world of Atzilus. It's the intellect of the world of Atzilus, is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. However, that is only true up to the world of Atzilus, the highest of the four spiritual worlds. The highest of the four spiritual worlds is a bit misleading because there's a lot in Kabbalah that's above Atzilus. There's a reason why the worlds are only four, and what's above Atzilus are not included in the four worlds, and that's a discussion for a different time, maybe. But what is above the world of Atzilus, what is above the highest of the four spiritual worlds, there what the Rambam said is not true. What the Rambam said is not true, that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and that's the solution to what it means that God is one. That solution and that understanding of God being one and God's unity only extends to the world of Atzilus, the highest of the four spiritual worlds. Beyond that, the Kabbalah would say, it does not hold true. As it's explained elsewhere, the Ein Sof, God's infinite light, is infinitely uplifted and exalted beyond the level of Chabad. Until Chabad, to God, is considered as if creating a physical being. In other words, Atzilus, what we're talking about is the highest of the four spiritual worlds, which is an expression of God that's completely unified with him. That is to God like creating the physical world. It's as distant from God himself as creating the physical world. So in other words, what the Kabbalah basically says is that the Rambam's conception of God is totally tied down to it's totally bound by within a certain framework, and it doesn't get beyond the point of the creation of the physical world. In other words, from the long perspective of Kabbalah, the highest perspective of philosophy is really quite low. It never gets any closer to God than the physical world itself, which is a very bold statement. If you really understand what the Rambam means by the knower, the knowledge, and the known, it's very bold that this gets no closer to God than the physical world itself. Sisa, as it's written, you made them all with Chachma. This is the proof that Chachma is like Asiya, that Chachma is a lower expression of God. And that is the footnote in Tanya in chapter 2 of Tanya. V'harich b'zasham chelek beis perek tes. And he explains this more at length in the second part of Tanya, chapter 9. Okay. Yun Sham. Okay. You gotta be kidding.
Yeah.
I'm special. It's okay. I got it. It's not. It's good. Okay. All right. All of that was review, believe it or not. What time? Someone have a watch I can borrow, please?
30. Coming right up.
Okay. We are on page 69 where the text gets bigger. Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel very nice. I feel like I'm in a watch. I feel like I'm in Switzerland. Okay. Bira Inyan. Yeah, you're with me. Page 69, where the lines get wider again. Yeah. Bira Inyan. L'havir mashakasuv ach lo'ila ma'ila ma'atzilus. So now the question becomes, what does the Alter Rebbe mean when he says that the Rambam's understanding that this knower knowledge and the known as the highest expression of God's unity does not extend above the world of Atzilus? What does this mean? What does it mean that it extends to Atzilus but no higher? The Hainu, Shasham leitachin lemer afilu hu yedei v'hu adei chulu, which means to say that there, meaning above Atzilus, it's not possible to say even that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. In other words, we're setting up for it's going to be a clash of the titans. But the setup is as follows: that the Rambam's understand. It's very important to get this notion. It's very important for Judaism and for an understanding of God, what it means to have faith in God, and all of these things. It's very important to get this matter of God's simplicity clear. What do we mean when God is simple? And the Rambam, the Kabbalah says that the Rambam is sufficing with the knower, the knowledge, and the known. But by higher standards, that does not suffice. The knower, the knowledge, and in other words, we're going to basically be...
suffice?
It's not enough. Lama speak.
Sufficient.
It is not. The Rambam is not going to... the Kabbalah is basically going to say your understanding of God's simplicity, the knower, the knowledge, and the known is not simple. It's not enough. It's not simple enough. You're not abstracting God enough away from the world, right? Basically, the Rambam's notion of the simplicity of God is going to be called into question, and it's not us that's going to call it into question. God forbid. It is actually going to be another great rabbi, as we see. Ve'ela echu. But rather, how can you describe him? In other words, we're going to describe the total abstraction and the simplicity of God that's much higher than the knower, the knowledge, and the known. So to understand all this, Hine Hagon HaMekubal Rav Yehuda Lui. I don't even know how you pronounce it in the Hebrew pronunciation, but it's Lu, I think. Lui. Ben Rav Betzalel of Prague, the Maharal of Prague, who you may have heard of before. It turns out that he's not just famous for making a golem. It turns out that he wrote many Sfarim on Torah, which are unbelievably beautiful, many of them. We wrote a whole commentary on the stories of the Talmud and many other Sfarim. So the Maharal, Rabbi Shel Tosfos Yom Tov, the teacher of the famous Tosfos Yom Tov, who wrote a very famous commentary on the Mishnah, is going to be the rabbi who argues with the Rambam. The Maharal is the one who's taking the Rambam to task. And this is known, if you speak to people who know and study Chassidus, this is known as the famous disagreement of the Rambam and the Maharal. This is a known episode that we're about to get into. It was very exciting.
Were they contemporaries?
No, they were not contemporaries. The Maharal lived after the Rambam, but nevertheless seemed to feel confident in challenging him, which is not very common, but is not unusual either. It depends who you're dealing with. In other words, suffice it to say, if the Maharal is willing to argue on the Rambam, it's because the Maharal has a good reason. It's not because it's not like if you or I argued with the Rambam. God forbid. Okay, so the Maharal says as follows: "B'Hakdamasa the Sefer Gvuras Hashem." In the Hakdama, in the preface to his Sefer Gvuras Hashem, Hissig ma'ed al das ha'imrim u'matarim eisa shua yedea v'hu adea chulu. He's hissig ma'ed. He strongly objects to the opinion of those who say and describe God as the knower, the knowledge, and the known. The Maharal has serious issues with this. And he at great length responds to them, and he offers utter rebuttal. This is what he says. This is what the Maharal is arguing on the concept of the knower, the knowledge, and the known as a description of God, and more specifically a description of God's simplicity. Ra'a shem emrim alav she'atzmusei seichel mufshat. They are saying that God, atzmusei, God Himself, is a seichel mufshat, is abstract knowledge. Is knowledge abstracted? In other words, they are saying that what is God? What is the Rambam's highest understanding of God? He's saying basically that He is a being of intellect. Now, we have to preface. The Rambam does not say that God is simply a being of intellect like our intellect, right? In fact, the Rambam is actually saying that God is not like our intellect. That's the whole point of the argument, if you'll remember. The whole point is that God knows things not the way we know them. He's not intellect as we normally understand it. God is some sort of he's some sort of being that transcends the boundaries of what we normally understand as intellect. But nevertheless, He is described as the knower, the knowledge, and the known. In other words, the Rambam, even though he is describing an intellect which transcends what we normally think of intellect, he's describing something that's far beyond what, when we normally speak of intellect, what we mean, nevertheless, he is still defining it within the boundaries of the knower, the knowledge, and the known. He is still saying that what is God not, right? Because it's all negative theology. What is God not? He is not lacking in intellect in such a way that he thinks the way that we think, etc. In other words, God is basically a being of intellect, except that He doesn't have any of the limitations of intellect that we have. He is a higher form of intellect.
So then you have to say beyond comprehension.
Sure. He is beyond comprehension, absolutely. But the thing is that this is important because you're going to see that the disagreement here is very subtle, and it's hard to understand unless you're a genius or someone explained it to you, why the Maharal is getting upset over something that's so subtle. The Rambam doesn't say that God is just beyond comprehension in general. In other words, it's not like a carte blanche. I just don't know what God is. The Rambam is saying that I know what God is by saying what He's not, and what He's not is a limited intellect like our intellect, such that Him and His knowledge and what He knows are three separate things. He's all those things together in a unity as one. That's what he says about God. So the Rambam says, so the Maharal says, basically what you're saying is that God is a seichel mufshat. He's an intellect. He is an intellect who is not like our intellect, who is beyond comprehension, as you say. V'kol seichel hu sheyedea hadavar b'nafshei k'mei shu chutz l'nafshei. Every intellectual understanding knows something in itself, in its soul, as it exists outside of one's soul. Says the Maharal, "Ve'im kain yiyahu yisbarich nismach al asher alulim mimenu." Therefore, his existence depends on the things that are caused from him. Footnote 16. Since knowledge involves the objective comprehension of other entities, it needs those other entities for its fulfillment. For without them, there would be nothing to know. Hence, it is dependent on those other entities for its fulfillment, and this cannot be said about God. In other words, when you know anything, you know it from outside of you. The Maharal is basically negating the idea from the start. He's saying that the whole nature of knowledge is to apprehend or to grasp something that is outside of you. You're not, in other words, if God knows about the table, right, the Maharal is saying you can say that God knows the table through knowing Himself all day long. At the end of the day, if He actually knows the table, then what He knows is it and not Himself. If He actually knows it. You understand what I'm saying? If it's actually the table He knows, then He doesn't know Himself. He knows the table, Maharal's saying, right? In which case, since it's supposed to be His knowledge of the table, which sustains the table in existence, it is His very knowledge of the table, which in a sense creates the table, you're basically creating a circle. You're saying that His knowledge, which causes the table, is only caused by the table. That's what the Maharal is saying. He's saying that if you only know it as it's outside of you, that must mean that the thing which is outside of you is causing you to create it. If that makes it doesn't make any sense. If you understand the argument is that it's a circle. The argument is that it doesn't make any sense, right? So God knows the table. God knows the table. Number one, God knowing the table is what makes the table exist, right? As everyone agrees, as the Rambam agrees as well, right? God knowing the table is what makes the table exist. But on the other hand, if he knows the table, he doesn't know it from as it is within him or whatever. If he knows it, then he actually knows it as it truly is. As the table is in actuality.
What it truly is, it's within him.
No, as it is within actuality, as the table actually is. There's no tables in God. God is simple, right?
Right.
So God is simple and he knows a table. The table is not within him. He knows something outside of him. So in other words, it's the table is causing his knowledge of the table, which is itself causing the table.
You're saying it's limitations is what you're saying.
What?
I think you're saying it's limitations.
No, not its limitations. It's logically incoherent, the Maharal is saying. The Maharal is saying that the table must exist to be known, but it's the knowledge of the table which is supposed to make it exist. This whole thing doesn't work.
It's a loop. It's running.
Exactly. Doesn't hold water, yeah. The cause, the cause would be, the effect would be before the cause, as it were, right? The effect is causing the cause. It's all backwards. The table is causing God's knowledge of the table. It's supposed to be that God's knowledge of the table causes the table, right? But really, if you think about it, if God knows the table, then the table is causing his knowledge of it. You understand? Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Let's do 17, I guess. Pardon?
The table is an extension of God's knowledge.
No, we wouldn't be so bold as to say something like. Let's say at the moment we wouldn't be so bold as to say something like that, because no, we wouldn't be so bold to say something like that. We're not thinking mystically. There's God and there's the world. The table does not exist as an extension of God's knowledge. The table exists as something completely separate from God. There's no way that God's knowledge. In fact, the whole argument, right, is that God. We have to abstract God's knowledge away from the world, because if God's knowledge was like the world, then it would be a part of Him, and we can't have God having parts. Right? We're trying to come to the conclusion that God's knowledge is not a contradiction to simplicity, right? Therefore, the table should not be an extension of God's knowledge. You understand the problem? We're arguing in the opposite direction. If the table is an extension of God's knowledge, then God has an infinite number of parts, because there's infinite creation.
Why can't he just create objects?
What do you mean? You're just saying out of the blue?
Yeah.
No.
So he creates the table.
No, completely. If you're willing to a priori abandon all attempts to understand or impose any sort of logic upon God, absolutely you can, no question. The problem begins when you try and understand. That's when all the problems begin. Absolutely, you're 100% right. We're not all the limitation. When we're saying God can't do something, we're saying He can't do something within a certain boundary, and that boundary is not real for Him. It's real for us. You understand? So, in other words, we're working within our own logic. That's the whole problem. The problem is us trying to understand.
It's this dimension.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to.
So, can you say it's the same thing? But this is the difference between what's revealed and what's concealed. So, within His knowledge, He knows. The fact that He knows creates it, but He knows also the way we see it is the thing that is outside of Him.
Yeah, then He has to have two knowledges.
Why?
No.
Why?
No, it's the same
Why
knowledge.
two knowledges?
He knows.
What makes the distinction then? What makes the distinction between inside
It's the
and
same
outside?
knowledge, but the way we take this knowledge is it's different than the way He takes it.
No. We're not making a. We're not imposing. There's no two separate realities of perspective here. That's not what we're talking about. God Himself. We're trying. If we don't have to, we're trying not to come up with all these theories, right? The assumption at the beginning, right? Your question was from a similar perspective. The assumption at the beginning is that we can understand something about God and how He creates reality objectively. That's the assumption at the beginning. If you throw away that assumption, then the whole conversation becomes meaningless. God is omnipotent; He can do whatever He wants. I'm serious.
Which is true.
Yes, absolutely. That is true. That is ultimately true. I'm not sure how many people in the Sefer that we're reading with regards to the Rambam or the Maharal would agree necessarily that it's true. But the Tzemach Tzedek would definitely agree that it was true. That God could do whatever He wants. But God can do whatever He wants it's one sentence and then it's over and then we're done. And now there's nothing we can know about Him, right? We're done.
We know everything about Him once we said that.
Yeah, you know everything and you know nothing. That's awfully similar once you at that level.
Why would the Maharal and the Rambam not take that opinion?
What opinion?
That you said that basically that he could do anything at any time.
Because there's no.
Because you got a bulldog stuff.
Well, there's a few answers to that question. The simplest answer, and the answer that the Rambam would give himself, so to speak, from the perspective of when he was writing his philosophy, what the Rambam would say would be something along the lines of God is bound by logic. Is basically what he would say. In fact, I think he literally does say that. The Rambam says God is bound by logic. If you ask the Rambam, why is God bound by logic? I don't know. There's a chapter in Moreh Nevuchim which is basically about. It's a short chapter, and it's basically about God is bound by logic. I don't know. I can't remember the details, but that's basically what the Rambam would argue. Philosophically, he would say God is bound by knowledge, which makes sense. It makes sense. It makes sense to at least assume a priori that God is bound by knowledge. If you're trying to philosophize, you understand? If you're trying to understand the world and how everything fits together, right, and how everything makes sense together and the world, and you come to the conclusion that the world needs a creator, so it makes sense that you would approach it at least assuming that everything that God does makes sense within logic, right? Because you're trying to understand with logic, right? You're hoping that there's a correspondence between the way the mind works and the way the world is, and the way God is. That if we come with logic, and that's the only tool we have to understand, so that you want God to fit into that. Can you actually substantiate that belief becomes a more complicated question. Kabbalah and Chassidus absolutely do not agree that God is bound by logic. They say that logic is a creation like everything else. So then the question becomes...
So there's really two schools of thought. One is you approach God by trying to define what God is, and another is that you approach by saying what God is not.
Yeah, but which one's which? The philosophy approaches by saying what God is not.
There's a frontier, really.
Yeah, philosophy approaches by saying what God is not. Kabbalah more approaches by saying what God is, although Kabbalah never actually says what God is. Never Kabbalah, if you could say, right, saying what God is not really something wise people get into. Kabbalah explains different levels of God's expression. Right? It never says what God is. Nevertheless, it is in the business of saying what things are. That's for sure. Right? Philosophy is in the business of saying what things are not, very roughly, when speaking about God. But that's a whole, not to get too off topic here. Okay, so the Maharal has a problem with the Rambam. The Maharal's problem with the Rambam is that the logic is circular, right? The knowledge of the table is supposed to create the table, but the table, to an extent, to know the table has to be creating the knowledge of the table, right? There has to be a table, there has to be something to know. Okay. And if you were to say that he is really understanding himself, which seems to be that's the out that the Rambam's trying to use, right? The Rambam tries to say that God's knowledge is not like that, right? The Rambam's whole answer is that God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. This limitation, that the knowledge of something has to be knowledge of something outside of you, and knowledge of the thing itself, rather than simply knowing yourself. The Rambam argues by saying that he's the knower, the knowledge, and the known, that's not true. That by God, he knows everything by knowing himself, right? So the Maharal says, and if you want to say that he knows everything by knowing himself, which is what the Rambam wants to say, that is indeed what the Rambam wants to say. Since he is the reason for those things to exist, and you want to say that let's use his translations, the conceptualization, the one who conceives it, and the concept, as the Rambam in the language of the Rambam, the knower, the knowledge, and the known. Davar echad, and you want to say that these are all one, as they elaborated to with regards to these things. And therefore, his comprehension of himself would be the cause of everything that exists. Right? In other words, it is not God's. Right? This is the Rambam's. This is the whole argument. Really, why does the Rambam Again, why does the Rambam have to say God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known at once? Basically, for the problem the Maharal brings up, and other similar problems, right? The table can't cause God. The knower of the knowledge of God as a separate faculty of his cannot cause God, right? God is uncaused. Since God is uncaused, the Rambam concludes that God must know everything by knowing himself, and that the knowledge is not a separate faculty. The knowledge is part of that whole. He knows without a faculty of knowledge, like human beings have. It's all one, right? That's basically why the Rambam comes to this conclusion. And therefore, it is not the understanding, that the Rambam argues, it is not the understanding of the table that creates the table. It is God's understanding of himself which creates the table in a process I do not understand. I'm not sure what that means, that God's knowledge of himself creates the table exactly. I don't know exactly. I have some suspicions for more Nevuchim, but I'm not sure. Maybe he said it outright and I forgot. I don't remember. But God knows him, by knowing himself, he creates the table, right, theoretically. And therefore he himself he is the understanding and what is understood, right? Remember, the Maharal is explaining the Rambam's position very well in order to knock it down, right? We're in the Maharal, reminder of where we are. Is everyone with me, roughly? Yeah. The Maharal is explaining the Rambam's position in order to knock it down, right? Which is very convenient because his explanation has given us a much more solid grasp, I think, of what the Rambam meant.
Basically, he's saying that he puts the wagon in front of the horse.
That's the accusation. So the Rambam's way of escaping the accusation is to say simply, Kacha, he knows everything exists out of his knowing himself.
Rambam or
The Rambam. The Rambam gets out of this problem, which would be a circular logic, that the knowledge of the table creates the table, which in turn creates the knowledge of the table. How does that? And that's only one of the many problems with saying that God's knowledge is separate from him. So how does the Rambam get out of that problem? By saying it simply is that God's knowledge is different than ours, and he knows everything, and by knowing himself. He knows everything by knowing himself. That's the solution. Says the Maharal. The Maharal is not feeling very charitable. The Maharal says, after that whole thing is understood, and after all the words are said on that opinion, the whole thing is batel u'mevutel. The whole thing has no value whatsoever. It's completely, the whole idea the Maharal is saying is completely worthless. This whole notion and this whole explanation. I'm on the second line of page 70.
He was a cousin of Steinsaltz or something.
Rabbi Steinsaltz, I think, would beg to be known. He would take that as the highest compliment, I'm sure. In general, when you get into the rabbinical texts, you find out that rabbis, in Torah at least, rabbis were never very generous. Going back to the Talmud and continuing until modern times, rabbis are not necessarily very generous with the opinions with which they strongly disagree. But it's all l'shem shamayim. Ideally, it's all for the sake of heaven. And God forbid to say that the Maharal would say this except if it was for the sake of heaven, the sake of Torah learning and finding the truth. V'zeu ki aseichel hu meyuchad bedavar. Why is the Rambam's escape useless according to the Maharal's opinion? Why does the Rambam's escape from this issue not work when he says everything is known by God knowing himself? Because seichel u'meyuchad bedavar, because seichel and intellect has a specific definition. Seichel is set aside for one purpose, for one thing. Like you would say that intellect is the knowledge of the thing as it is. And God, on the other hand, has no definition that can describe him. He has no limits, and he has no definition, and he has no description. And if you say that God himself is intellect, which remember, where the Maharal is arguing, the Rambam is fundamentally saying that God himself is intellect, just not an intellect limited like human intellect, you are fundamentally limiting him. Seichel itself, just being intellect, he's saying, no matter whether the intellect knows itself or knows something else, right? It doesn't make a difference. Your escape by saying it's something that knows itself rather than knowing other things, the Maharal is saying is not an escape. The Rambam, by saying that God knows himself rather than knowing something else, misses the entire point. The knowing is the problem in the first place. Knowing is the problem. Saying that God can know, no matter what he knows, even if it's some sort of very...
limitation.
Right. Even some sort of... Exactly. Even some sort of abstract knowledge, which is not like human knowledge at all, which you have to understand, is a very high and lofty understanding of God. If you can come to a true understanding of what that means, that he doesn't understand in the way we understand. But even this abstraction, that he knows everything by knowing himself, is still intellect, and intellect itself is the problem. To say that God is knowing, even if he doesn't know the way we know, even if you remove and abstract away and remove all limitations, it's nevertheless still knowing, and that's a problem. Lekach, therefore, therefore, concludes the Maharal, well, not concludes, but the Maharal says, this is the Maharal's opinion, we do not say that he is a specific thing at all. To say that he's identified with any one faculty or any one capacity, so to speak. V'lefichach sichlei omrim sichlu, I think, omrim shatz musay seichel. Therefore, it is foolish for those who say that God is intellect. Rather, about God, you cannot say he is any specific type of thing. And remember, the more you think about it, the harder it is to find the distinction. It's very hard because it's very subtle. When the Rambam's saying God is intellect, he's saying it in a very, very refined way. He's not saying God is intellect and pinning him down like you would define anything normally. It is some sort of anti-definition, and even this negative definition, says the Maharal, still falls in the category of intellect, and it shouldn't be used to describe God. God is simply God. There is no category with which to describe God, even in this very negative way. Even to extrapolate him away from seichel, from intellect, that's also incorrect. There is no description for God, and he is not a being of intellect. If you're still calling him intellect or describing him in terms of intellect, that is not simplicity. Let's do footnote 19. To summarize, Rambam and the others who followed his approach attempted to explain that wisdom, and similarly the other powers, do not represent a contradiction to God's unity because they are one with him. Maharal disputes that premise, explaining that knowledge in its ordinary sense cannot be identified with God, for knowledge reaches its fulfillment through the objects which are known, and that cannot be said with regard to God. Maharal realizes that Rambam himself has identified that logical inconsistency, and sought to resolve it by stating with regard to God, the knower and the knowledge are one. Right? In other words, he understands that the Rambam is trying to get out of that problem. Maharal does not accept the resolution because knowledge, even perfect knowledge, even knowing through knowing himself, has a specific definition and can never truly be one with God, who is above all definition. So that's the Maharal's position. The Rambam's position is that God is the negative description of God as the knower, the knowledge, and the known. That's the Rambam's position. The Maharal's position is that God does not fit into any definition whatsoever. And even the knower, the knowledge, and the known is not simple enough. So let's continue with the Maharal's description of his position. We rather say that he is a simple existence, which is not defined at all. The ein inyan ze seichel, he does not exist as intellect. The ein anu yodim v'viyusay mehusay, and we cannot know his being and his being and his essence, his being and his nature. V'ula yemru im ein atzmusay seichel v'geshem chas v'shalom leimer alav in kein mahu yisbarich. Then the Maharal is saying, so if we're saying that he's not intellect, and God forbid to say that he's physical, right? That obviously not. Im kein ma'u yisbarich. If so, what is he? What is his blessed being? On the second line of page 72. Nashuv lahem, we answer to them, v'chi haneshama shebeguf ha'adam yuchol lamed ala mitasa. The soul which is in the body of man, can you understand it truthfully? Can you understand its truth? Kol shekein v'kol shekein beira kol she'ein lishlo alav kushya zes. All the more so, and all the more so, the creator of everything, the creator of all, you cannot ask upon him this question. The Maharal is saying, the question is the problem. The question is the problem. Why are you trying to understand? You can't even understand what your soul is, what your soul really is. How are you going to understand what the creator of all is? The Maharal says the question is, he rejects the question out of hand. God is obviously something simple which cannot be described in any terms, and therefore to even ask the question of what he is just wasting time. What's the point? You can't ask what God is, the Maharal is saying. Even as a verse to back it up, which says that man cannot see me and live, as it says in the book of Exodus. You can't see God. There's no knowing God. All of these things can be understood from his holy names. As God's essential name is expressed in the term Havaya, God's four-letter name, the Tetragrammaton, is expressed in those four letters. To teach that this is his essence. In other words, Havaya, the four-letter name of God, is basically a conjugation of the word to be. What is God? God is being. Simple being. You can't define him. He simply is. There is no definition. There's no description. That's what he's saying. He's saying when the four-letter name of God, which is meant to go and describe God as he is at his essence, it's not a conjugation of the word seichel, of intellect, or anything like that, or of knowing. He's not called the all-knowing. The simple name, the simple four-letter name, which describes God as he truly is, the Maharal is saying, is being. He simply is. There is no description. Intellect, by contrast, is not simply being. There's a distinction between intellect and simply being. In other words, intellect is a much more defined thing than simply being. Right? Being is a quality that intellect shares with everything else that exists. Therefore, we see that being is more fundamental than intellect alone. Being is a separate thing from intellect. Being is just being. It's not intellect at all. You should understand these things thoroughly until you hear the words of the Maharal. The words of the Maharal are they're a bit mysterious. It's hard to really understand what is actually going on here, right? You have a very subtle negative understanding of God. And the Maharal is saying it's not enough. The Maharal is saying that this subtle negative understanding, because it's defined in terms of intellect, is insufficient. And therefore we must say that God is really just a being. God is not a being of intellect, right? And the argument, you can imagine the argument continuing, that the Rambam would say in turn, I'm not defining him as a being of intellect. The intellect is just the means to get to this being who is not like us at all. You would think the Rambam would answer. But the Maharal seems to say that there's still something in the process. There's something about the way the Rambam arrives at his understanding of what God is. That's not, even though he says that it's something that no one can understand, he's still saying that in some way it's connected to understanding. In some way it's beyond knowledge, but perhaps it's knowable. It's some form of intellect. There's something about it that doesn't work for the Maharal. So let me explain to you what's really going on here. Right? And this is what I have my notes for. I had someone who's much more knowledgeable in Chassidus than I am help me try and figure out what's really going on here. 1 second. I have to decide whether we should do this now or later.
There's some more explanation when you keep reading.
There is. He's going to go more into his opinion. Maybe I'll save it.
Don't do that.
What time is it? Oh, we're way over time.
Gonna have to come back.
Yeah, I have to come back next week, God willing. Sorry. I realize how far over time we went.